Welcome, everyone, to the Tenement Museum's book talk this evening, featuring Windows on the Bowery, 400 Years on New York City's Oldest Street. I'm Dave Favaloro, Senior Director of Curatorial Affairs at the Tenement Museum, and I'm glad to be with you virtually tonight. Thanks for tuning in. Before we get started, if you're watching this event live, you can ask questions and add comments for our participants throughout the event. We'll, of course, have dedicated time at the end of our talk this evening for answering all of your questions, but please feel free to ask them throughout the event using the chat function. If you're not familiar with the Tenement Museum, we're a museum that tells the stories of immigrants, migrants, and refugees in the United States. We're in a history museum located in New York's Lower East Side. We often tell stories that are place-based, tied to history of the built environment and how it has changed over time. So we're very excited to be speaking tonight with two individuals whose work has explored this very idea of place and story, and I think in an interesting, exciting way. This evening, David Mulkins and Mindy Lang are going to guide us through not only the history of the Bowery, of course, but through the story of the Bowery Alliance of Neighbors and how this wonderful book came into being, all of the twists and turns of that. So stay tuned. Before we begin, I, of course, want to make you aware that tonight's featured book is available for sale via the Tenement Museum's online shop. A link will be shared again in the chat. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce you to our speakers tonight. David Mulkins is co-founder of the Bowery Alliance of Neighbors, which works to preserve, protect, and celebrate the city's oldest street. He taught history and cinema studies at the High School of Arts and Design for 25 years and has lived just off the Bowery for 35 years. He has presented films and illustrated talks at the Tenement Museum, and again tonight, the New York Public Library, Cooper Union, Film Forum, Anthology Film Archives, and the Bowery Poetry Club. He is editor, contributing writer for the book Windows on the Bowery, 400 Years on New York City's Oldest Street. It's a long title you guys have come up with. It's not the longest in the world, but I'm sure I'll get that right by the end of this. And of course, Mindy Lang has been affiliated with the Cooper Union for nearly 40 years, beginning as a student in the School of Art. Currently, she is creative director in the Office of Communications, overseeing the design and production of the majority of the institution's visual collateral and working with Cooper colleagues to present public programming in the school's historic Great Hall. Lang taught the professional practice design class in 2015 when the Windows project became the focus for third-year art students. Charis Barrios and Sarah Persian, did I pronounce those right? Probably not close though, I hope. They collaborated on the overall design, each designing a number of the individual posters. The project was so well received by the community that Lang was asked to design the Windows on the Bowery commemorative book. And of course, we'll learn more about that this evening. So, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers, but I was going to ask David if you can begin by telling us, of course, about the Bowery Alliance of Neighbors and how you got the idea for the book.
Thanks, David. I appreciate it a lot. And by the way, we're just very honored to have been asked by Tenement Museum to have this book talk, because the Tenement Museum has just done wonders celebrating and narrating the working and living lives of the immigrants and the working class. And we feel that the history of the Bowery tells where the immigrants and the working class went to eat, drink, have a good time, and express themselves, as some of which we'll hopefully get to in this presentation. First of all, the Bowery stretches 1¼ miles from Chatham Square to Cooper Square. It originally went all the way up to Union Square. And actually the term Union Square, I always thought it must have something to do with unions or the Civil War, but it actually was a reference to the fact that the two great streets in early New York, Broadway and the Bowery, had their point of union at Union Square. The Bowery was originally a Lenape Native American footpath, then it was a Dutch farm road. The city's first free Black homesteads were on the lower part of the Bowery. George Washington and his troops had a triumphal march down the Bowery as the British were evacuating. And Lincoln's anti-slavery speech, the one that put him over as president, was made at Cooper Union. And the Bowery was also stomping ground for gangs, gays, sailors, shopgirls, and immigrant Irish, Italians, Germans, Jews, and Chinese. There's a lot of talk today about the multicultural aspects of American society. And I think the Bowery is one of the earliest places that you could say was truly an expression of this multicultural nature of our society. It by no means was without its own prejudices, but it was a place that I think had a much wider embrace than you would have gotten in most other places. The Bowery was also New York City's first entertainment district, and it has seminal links to tap dance, vaudeville, Yiddish theater, Stephen Foster, Irving Berlin, Harry Houdini, modern tattooing, abstract expressionism, beat literature, improvisational jazz, and punk rock. America's first streetcars were on the Bowery. The great writer Luc Sant said of it, it is one of the great American streets, as charged with historical significance as Beale Street in Memphis or Bazin Street in New Orleans. Walt Whitman, as you see in this quote here, he loved the democratic nature of the streets and how there was just such a mixture that one would find on the street. And by the way, this is a really interesting painting of the early Bowery. It was one of the first electrified streets in the country. Now, back to David's question, how did the Bowery Alliance of Neighbors get started? We formed in 2007 in reaction to what was considered widely in our community to be wildly out of scale developments. And in particular, in an area that was typified by 4- and 5-story buildings, suddenly we found out this 22-story Cooper Square hotel was about to rise. And when we found out that it was because the zoning allowed it, that's when we formed to try to get a more reasonable, respectful, contextual zoning to save our neighborhood. Very near that high rise you were just looking at, there was another building that stood at 35 Cooper Square. It was built by one of the Dutch governor's descendants, Nicholas Stuyvesant. Famous people that lived there include the beat poetess Diane de Prima, the actor Joel Grey, and Claude Brown, who wrote Man-Child in the Promised Land. And there was a big fight to try to save the building. Many organizations, such as Village Preservation and Historic Districts Council, even before we were formed, were trying to save the building. And sadly, the Landmarks Preservation Commission did not even have a hearing, and the building was destroyed in May of 2011. This is another example of out of scale, out of context, sky's the limit overbuilding that we were seeing in many parts of the city. The little building you see there is one of New York City's landmarks, the Germania Fire Insurance Building. And this skyscraper destroys the historic sense of place that you get not only on Bowery, but also around the corner on the cultural district of East 4th Street. Another building further down the Bowery, 91 Bowery. The owner of this construction enterprise was responsible for the destabilization of 2 adjacent buildings that unfortunately had to be torn down because of this destruction, and 60 tenants and a Chinese restaurant were displaced. And this was our commentary on, this crazy kind of architecture. Skyscrapers of glass and steel thundering across the Bowery. See entire buildings mass evicted. See elected officials turned into stone by big money from the Real Estate Board of New York. See small businesses and historic buildings crushed by overdevelopment. The monolith monsters crushing all that stand in their path. That's actually the title is actually a science fiction film from the 1950s, and we just brought it up to date. One thing I will say is we just got a newly elected city council member for District 1, Chris Marte, who definitely is a very neighborhood-friendly guy. Now, the Bowery Alliance and Neighbors has successfully gotten several important buildings landmarked, as you see here. But we also tried very hard in 2009 with the East Bowery Preservation Plan to get some kind of more reasonable height caps on the east side of the Bowery, ones that would match the 84-foot height cap that you find on the west side of most of the Bowery. We got tremendous support from businesses, well-known people like Philip Glass, and restaurateurs like Keith McNally, and most of our elected officials. Doris Diether, who's this beloved figure, preservationist from Lower Manhattan, who died very recently, she designed the plan for us. Martin Scorsese, along with many, many others, sent letters to city planning endorsing the East Bowery Preservation Plan. And at the same time that we were pursuing that, we also, in collaboration with Two Bridges Neighborhood Council, we spent a couple of years getting a special plan that was presented to the State and National Register of Historic Places to make the Bowery from Chatham Square to Cooper Square a designated landmark district on the State and National Register of Historic Places. Can the picture of Carrie Culhane be seen on the right? Or is it can be seen on the screen? Yeah, Carrie did extraordinary work. And if you go to our website or you Google the Bowery Historic District National Register, it's about 200 pages, and it's just incredible research on all the different buildings on the Bowery. Historian Mike Wallace wrote to city planning that it would be a pity if the Bowery got bulldozed out of existence. The National Register designation suggests the country agrees. Shouldn't the city do the same? And finally, we come to, as we were going through all of this tremendous history that I mentioned earlier of the Bowery, we realized that we really needed to raise consciousness about the street, because most people on the street, if you ask them, why is the Bowery important? Most people would say, oh yeah, drunks and flop houses. But it has a very old history. It's the oldest street in the city. And so many important, historical and cultural things are associated here. So we over a 2-year period, we began to plan and carry out an historic signage project, the Bowery Signage Project, which we later named Windows on the Bowery. When the poster project was completed, there were 65 historic signage posters, which were displayed real big in the western windows of Cooper Union's Foundation building, as well as smaller versions inside the HSBC Bank, a domed historic landmark on the corner of Canal and Bowery, and that's the manager, Catherine Ng. Now, just a few things about the project. People ask us all the time, how did you get this done? Well, we got the idea for it, and we had, over a period of many months, we would periodically meet. There was about 10 of us, and we brainstormed which particular people, events, and buildings we would want to have, some signage pieces about. Then what type of signage? A lot of times you see little bronze plaques on the side of buildings. We decided that was just way too much trouble, too much red tape, too expensive. And so we opted in the end to go for 18 by 24 inch signs, which were laminated. And our idea was to have them displayed in windows up and down the Bowery. And we were very successful in getting quite a lot, I would say the majority of the posters displayed beginning in 2016, but it was a tremendous effort of outreach, sometimes requiring going through a network of 6 or 7 different managers and district managers and so forth. One of our big debates was how many words to put in the signage pieces. And many of us felt like if we just, put a name, dates, a few pictures, it would be little more than advertisement. We really wanted to tell a slightly more in-depth story on these people in these places. And so we opted for 150 to 200 words, which, as you'll see, was a tremendous challenge for Mindy Lang and her team that designed the plan. Mitchell Grubler came up with the idea of calling it Windows on the Bowery, which of course represents a window into the past, a window into the history, but also the window itself where the posters were displayed. And we also, in addition to trying to get really eye-catching images, we also wanted to have a title on the pieces that would kind of jump out at the passersby in the same way that 100 and some years ago, if you were walking down the Bowery, the barkers outside the dime museums and theaters would have approached you with "Step right up and see the freaks and the assassins," and so forth inside these dime museums. Carrie Culhane's National Register work was foundational for this project. And we reached out to mostly writers and researchers that we knew, people that might have specialized in certain areas, like Travis D. is a vaudeville historian. We asked him to do pieces related to vaudeville. And in some cases, we reached out to family members. Hilly Crystal, the founder of CBGB, we reached out to his daughter. And then how many images? Most of the posters had at least 5. And Others had as many as 25. For images, we visited probably 24 different image archives, museums, libraries. We went to private collectors. There was some tremendously generous archives and collectors and photographers. And special thanks to the photographers Bob Gruen, David Godless, Stephanie Chernikowski, the collector Adam Woodward was very generous. Harvard Theater Collection, New York Public Library, and New York Historical Society. There's, I believe, about 450 images in the book, as well as on the posters. For funding, La Vida Feliz Foundation, the Puffin Foundation, and the New York Victorian Society, as well as various friends on the Bowery. Now, who designed it? Of course, Mindy Lang, who's with us tonight, was the art director for the project. And I had asked Kent Barwick, who is president emeritus of Municipal Art Society and a much beloved former head of Landmarks Preservation Commission, if he had any ideas for printers. And he said, well, why don't you reach out to Cooper Union? They're on the Bowery. And it just so happened that on my block, and where our friend Carol Poutre lives, the head of architecture, Elizabeth O'Donnell, lived. And so we reached out to Elizabeth O'Donnell, and she said, well, give us a template, a rough idea of what it might look like. My wife, Louise Millman, designed a template, and we gave it to Elizabeth O'Donnell, and she turned it over to Mindy Lang. And I'm going to turn this over to Mindy to talk about how she was able to do this quite extraordinary project. And that's Mindy on the left too.
Yes, yes, not a very flattering picture. We've already discussed that. Hi, everyone. So yes, Cooper Union, I'm an alum of Cooper from 1982. I've been working there ever since, so forever and ever. I've been teaching a class called Professional Practice, which, you know, really sounds mysterious, but the idea is that our students, our graphic design students, usually third year and fourth year students, do work for nonprofit organizations that could be anything from a branding. I mentioned before that I think part of the consortium in the Lower East Side would be the museum at Eldridge Street. My students actually designed that logo in, I think, 2009. We've done work for the Bronx Museum of Art uses our logos. The Hudson Valley Shakespeare Festival upstate. So we're kind of, you know, all around New York cultural institutions, but also other nonprofits like Cancer Care. So the students get real life experience doing graphic design under my art direction with the support of our office here at Cooper Union. And we are able to offer the services that would cost probably thousands and thousands of dollars pro bono to our clients. Now, they don't always work out. This was kind of a Cinderella project that worked out perfectly, as was the Eldridge Museum project. So there are definitely success stories. They don't always work out this well, but this one certainly did. And there were really only 2 students, as David mentioned, and they designed the grid. And of course, when you have those come-ons, as you mentioned before, you know, freaks, assassins, giant squid, you know, you had me a giant squid. So, you know, that turned these, you know, there's somewhere in between posters and placards and pages of a book. I mean, they're a little bit more wordy than posters, but those big headlines and And actually each poster has, pretty much one, overarching image to grab the viewer in. And the students did a wonderful job keeping to a nice grid, and they all have a consistency to them, and they all, had a footer that celebrated the Bowery Alliance and where where this project came from. And 65 posters later, we had the installation in my home away from home, which is the Cooper Union Foundation building. And that was one of the two places that had all the posters together. And David, I think I'm right that when possible, each address had the poster for their address, right? Their street number. Sometimes the buildings were gone, unfortunately, but for the most part, it was terrific to walk up and down and see them in their real physical space. And then it was also nice to see them all together, in the two locations where they were an exhibition. And it was very gratifying for all of us to see people walking down Cooper Square or up Cooper Square and just stopping to read them all for the few months that they were there.
Every time we've had presentations or talking to people that were able to stop by Cooper Union and look at the entire series on the side of the building, even New Yorkers that have been here their entire lives would comment, gee, I had no idea that there was so much connected with this one street. And our hat has been off to Mindy and Cooper Union since this project was completed, and then the book, because when we started out, we were thinking in terms of maybe 25, 30 posters. And as we kept digging and digging, more and more came up. And then at one point, Tom Clem says, oh, why don't you do the buildings themselves, some of the historic buildings? And it eventually went from about 30, 35 posters to 65. And every step of the way, when I would have maybe 10 more posters or 15 more posters, Mindy was always, okay, and never got upset, never told me to get out of her office. And I just know that this project would never have achieved what it did without the help of Mindy Lang and the students at Cooper Union. And the entire project was a tremendous effort from the community. I would say if I had to start naming all the people to thank, it would probably be, 150 people that helped in so many different ways. There's just a few on the screen here. Eric Ferrara, who's the founder of the Lower East Side History Project. He wrote a bunch of the posters. Lenny Sloan worked on some of the pieces that touched on the performing arts and in particular African-American performers. Tom Clem, who's an experienced historic signage creator, did some tremendous things for us. Mitchell Grubler wrote more posters than anybody. He did all the ones pertaining to the architecture on the street. David Freeland, who just came out with a book about the history of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. He did a number of them for us as well. One of the big challenges, getting them in the windows, and here's a few examples of how it looks. These are some owners from stores that very graciously displayed our posters. And this is Hector Dominguez. He's the doorman if you ever go to Capitale, the former Bowery Savings Bank, really nice guy. And as we go through these, you'll see Mindy's design, as she said, usually upper right-hand corner, the Bowery address. And again, you know, a big red title that jumps out at you, and often a subtitle that is a little more calming in black, telling what the poster's subject actually is. One of the fun things about the project is when people would reach out to you, relatives of some of the figures that were celebrated in the posters, like this piece here, vaudeville, the vaudeville hook is born. That, of course, as you've seen in movies, if you're a really bad performer, they would call for the hook and they would pull you off stage. And it was created at 165 Bowery at Miner's Bowery Theater. And one day I got a phone call from his grandson, Harry Miner's grandson, Henry Miner. And this is W.C. Fields' granddaughter, Dr. Harriet Fields, who walked with me and visited 5 different locations on the Bowery that a very young W.C. Fields, back when he was a comic juggler, had played at a long time ago. The piece on the right here is referring to the fact that the first baseball club in America started at the Gotham Inn on the Bowery, and the Globe Dime Museum is where Harry Houdini made his first solo appearance. This is the book edition, which came out, I guess that was about 4 or 5 years after the signage project launched. And as I said, there's so many wonderful people to thank. And fortunately, many of them are on this screen here. Don't have time to read them all, but great people. Karen Lowe from Chinatown did a complete translation of the windows on the Bowery posters, a separate translation, which is available upon request. And the book, in addition to the posters, there's several pages that we just kind of inserted because there were images that hadn't made it into the posters that were just so evocative or just plain fun to look at. You may have heard that at one time there were mile markers, every mile going from the south of Manhattan up north. And the 1 mile marker once stood here at 214, 216 Bowery. And that Miner's Bowery Theater that I mentioned, where the vaudeville hook was born, you can see posters advertising it in the window. This is a piece about the Bull's Head Tavern, legendary tavern with adjacent slaughterhouse. This is where George Washington and his troops stopped to cool their heels, drink to the success of kicking the British out before making their way to the actual city, which was much further downtown. Eventually, the Bull's Head Tavern was bought by Heinrich Astor, and with all the interest in the TV show The Gilded Age, and Mrs. Astor being, you know, the leader of society who wants to keep out the riffraff, it's interesting that the Astor family actually starts in America on the Bowery in the butcher in the butcher trade, and in fact, Heinrich Astor, as well as John Jacob Astor, his younger brother, they at one point were big real estate barons on the Bowery and surrounding area. The Bull's Head eventually was torn down and became the, as you see down here, the Atlantic Garden, back when the Bowery concentration of Germans in the world, and its nickname was Little Germany, also known as Klein Deutschland. One of its big drawing powers was its ladies' orchestra. We looked at this earlier, the Germania Fire Insurance Building, and this is the piece that we did about that. In the book Lost New York, the German Winter Garden is one of the sites that are featured. That book, of course, looks at some tremendous architectural treasures that unfortunately were torn down. This building here no longer stands. It eventually was torn down and a parking lot went there. And today, this is where the very swank Bowery Hotel stands. The buildings down to the right of that building, Dry Dock Savings Bank, are still standing. This is a piece that Amy Chen did about Chinatown. The corner of Doyer Street and Bowery was, for most tourists and many New Yorkers, it was the first thing that you got a real taste of. The Chinese Tuxedo restaurant that you see there, that was one of the most popular. And Amy also touches on the fact that for many, many decades in our country's history, there were restrictive, repressive laws that were anti-Asian, anti-Chinese, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act. This piece looks at the history of transportation on the Bowery. The first streetcars, of course, started on the Bowery. There was a commemorative stamp about the streetcar being invented in 1832. And the Manhattan Bridge Plaza, which is right at where Canal is, when it was first built, was considered one of the most beautiful entryways to a bridge of any place in the country. And it's well overdue for being restored. This is a piece, this was the very last poster piece that came just before the book came out, and Mindy very graciously turned it into a poster. And Jerry Micarenda has a wonderful biography of Elizabeth Jennings, who for a long time was kind of forgotten, like so much in this project. But she was in 19th century New York City, she was like the Rosa Parks of her time. She had been on the what back then was the lower part of the Bowery. At the time, it was called Chatham Street. It later became Park Row. And she was thrown off of a streetcar and very bruised and bloodied. And she didn't take it lying down. She got a lawyer. She was from a very distinguished family. She played the piano at her church and had been on her way to church when she was treated like that. And quite extraordinarily, she won her law case. And that is when public transportation in New York City was desegregated. They're about to, sometime this year or next year, come out with a statue of Elizabeth Jennings that will be displayed at Grand Central. This is a piece that we're quite proud of about 134 and 136 Bowery, and this incredible many-decade-long, very active anti-slavery abolitionist effort that went on in this building. They even had a printing press. And Samuel Delaplane's family was quite prominent and supported, the effort to try to end slavery. At a much later time, one of the first YMCAs in the city was located in 134 Bowery, and the German sculptor painter Eva Hess lived there until her death in the 1960s and early 70s. This is another piece that came very late to us. And again, it's history that is not terribly well known. John Brown, everybody knows, was much further south when they executed him for the Harper's Ferry uprising. And he was a tremendous force against slavery. And after he was executed, they threw him in a pine box. He still had the noose around his neck, put the box on the train with his wife and her entourage. And as they were heading north to their home in upstate New York, the wife decided, you know, we really need to stop and get his body embalmed. And unfortunately, each time they tried to stop, the local officials said, you can't stop here, because John Brown was such a lightning rod figure. And so, under cover of darkness, some of John Brown's family friends smuggled the body into New York City to 163 Bowery, where there was a funeral parlor that was sympathetic to the abolitionist cause, and they embalmed his body and got it ready for the rest of the journey. I would say that my favorite piece in the whole series, which was done by Mick Maloney and Lenny Sloan, is this piece about the Bowery Theater, just because so much happened there. It's where some of the first Shakespeare was done in the city. It's where William Henry Lane popularized tap dance. Charles Dickens saw him and said he was the greatest dancer known. The theater saw the first performance of ballet in America. But the theater is also where you see the beginnings of minstrelsy, which was, of course, a very derogatory and very negative institution that had sway in the entertainment field in this country for probably 125 years. And by the way, T.D. Rice's performance of Jim Crow, that is where the term Jim Crow comes from. So it's interesting that something as despised as the Jim Crow laws have their namesake from this minstrel performance that was done at this theater, which of course was later torn down. Yiddish Theater's first American home was here on the Bowery. Jacob Adler performed at many of the theaters. Some of these theaters had thousands of seats. Jacob Adler was the father of Stella Adler, the great acting teacher of Marlon Brando. This is a piece about Italian theater and a dime museum that was here. You can see right here the Gaiety Dime Museum. Dime museums were kind of the poor man's version of P.T. Barnum's, huge theater in Lower Manhattan. You would have exhibits, often with really bogus, bizarre things, but at the same time, there was a performance space. So often you could see a play, or you could see acrobats and singers and so forth. And Italian theater in the city really has its origins at 138 Bowery. A little known fact, or as far as connecting the dots, I've rarely heard anybody point out that America's first two great songwriters, Stephen Foster and Irving Berlin, literally have a direct link to the Bowery within one block of one another. This is the oldest brick house in the city, the Edward Mooney House. And Irving Berlin, who started out as a newspaper seller when he was just a kid, but he learned that a lot of times you'd get more business if you could sing or dance. And Izzy Balin, as he was known back then, had caught the eye of Chuck Connors, this guy here who was famous for tours, spicy tours of Chinatown and the Bowery. Chuck Connors took Izzy down Pell Street. This is the corner of Pell and Bowery, and took him to the Pelham Cafe where he got a singing waiter job. And that's where Irving Berlin, songwriter of God Bless America and White Christmas, started writing songs. And this is the piece about Stephen Foster, one block up, his last residence, the New England Hotel at 30 Bowery, no longer with us. And sadly, Stephen Foster died with only $1 in his pocket. Very sad story. Musically, next to the Frank Sinatra recording of New York, New York, probably the most beloved song about New York, Sidewalks of New York, had its first performance here at 235 Bowery, where today the new museum is. The birthplace of modern tattooing was right around the corner from Bowery at 11 Chatham Square. And Samuel O'Reilly and Charlie Wagner are in many ways the father of American modern tattooing. And Wagner, that you see here, Wagner invented the apparatus that became the foundation for modern tattooing. This is a really interesting piece that Eric Ferrara did about the Bowery Boys, which not only goes into the actual, street tough firefighting Bowery Boys, but also the fact that the term Bowery Boys has had probably 5 or 6 different incarnations over time, including the movie series of the Bowery Boys, and more recently, the firefighters on Great Jones Street, right around the corner from the Bowery, are known as the Bowery Boys. Adam Woodward found this poster here of Oni Gagan's Boxing Saloon, and this shows John L. Sullivan, probably the most famous 19th century American boxer, performing here. Oni Gagan's Boxing Saloon eventually was torn down. Apparently minors were getting in there, but it was a really raucous place where even women would get into the boxing ring. This is a piece that David Freeland did about early gay nightlife in New York City. In the book, Gay New York, the first chapter in the book is the Bowery, and about how the Bowery in the late 1890s was just about the only place in the city that a gay person could go and feel they could express themselves. One of the most grisly pieces in the book is about McGurk's Suicide Hall. I'm not going to go into great detail, but look it up on Google, McGurk's Suicide Hall. There were about a dozen young prostitutes who committed suicide in McGurk's Suicide Hall. And their lives were so wretched. It started out two young women decided they were going to just drink themselves to oblivion, take carbolic acid, and end it all. And rather than hide from the negative publicity, McGurk kind of played it up because, rubberneckers and, tourist sightseers would come down to McGurk's suicide just on a dare. And later, many years later, another example of this incredible layer of very diverse history, the influential feminist Kate Millett lived in the building right at a time they were trying to tear it down. She wanted to turn the building into a landmark and put a museum in there that would celebrate the very difficult lives of women in early New York. This is a piece about the Astor Place riot. I think if ever a story from this area should have been made into a movie, it's this. Martin Scorsese absolutely should make this into a film. Scores of people were killed in this riot, and the whole thing really has its origins, in addition to class conflict. It was because of this American actor and British actor who did not like one another, and the whole thing just kept escalating out of control. Incredible story. This is a piece about the Bowery flop houses. We had to do one on that subject because, of course, that's what people expect. And our beloved Bowery Mission, this is a piece about that. Still doing great work even during COVID. If you go to our website, it's got a direct link to the Bowery Mission, which really needs your help during this COVID crisis. One of the two greatest, most important films set in the Bowery, this one happens to be a documentary, is On the Bowery, which came out in 1956. And it's about the down and out men on the Bowery. Very powerful film. Now, this is the Bowery Mission. And shortly after they located there, the Salvation Army built what for a time was the tallest Salvation Army hotel in the country. And the building still stands. For a while, it was turned into a swanky hotel, and then it became a shelter during COVID. And I understand, I think it's now back to being a hotel with maybe a youth hostel thrown in for good measure. And there you see Eva Booth, the daughter of the Salvation Army founder. Now, Mae West has a connection to this building. In an interview, when she was writing the play that eventually became the famous She Done 'Em Wrong movie with Cary Grant, she remembered the Bowery from her youth, and she was just traveling down the street in a cab, and she saw what she said was the most handsome man she ever laid eyes on, and he was a Salvation Army worker. And in the film, She Done 'Em Wrong, she falls in love with the Salvation Army guy. And this is the film, of course, that has the movie's most famous seduction line, "Come up and see me sometime." Sammy's Bowery Follies, the buildings are still there. This was sort of a kind of a dive bar that was turned into an entertainment venue when vaudeville was dying. And Sammy Fuchs knew a lot of the vaudeville performers and said, "Hey, why don't you come to my place?" But interestingly enough, instead of making it upscale, he kept a lot of the liquor prices cheap so that you would have this incredible mix of movie stars and, some of the down and out men from the Bowery Mission. This is Mindy's piece about Cooper Union. And
25 photos. I played favorites and added more for my home turf.
When all these different photos were turned in to Mindy, that was the closest she came to giving us our walking papers. And my jaw just dropped when I saw how she actually was able to get them all fit in here. This is where Lincoln made his famous anti-slavery speech. Frederick Douglass made speeches here, and Clara Lemlich, the labor leader, her speech at Cooper Union is very famous for, in this one speech, inspiring all these shirtwaist workers to go out on strike. Mindy, anything else you want to add about Cooper Union?
Just a little plug that we're still doing historic events here. We've had John Lewis here, a couple of years ago. We have probably the new mayor and the new governor speaking in the Great Hall. So, still doing it. Next time the poster will have 50 images on it.
Sounds good. This is a piece about the oldest continuously operating hotel in New York City. Today it's called Notel. I'm sorry, Sotel, as in Soho Hotel. Some of the people that hung out there, Boss Tweed, Teddy Roosevelt, boxers hung out there, and Big Tim Sullivan lived there. He was a Tammany figure who is most famous today for the Sullivan Law about not being able to carry concealed weapons. And probably the biggest gathering in the history of the Bowery was his funeral when he died. 75,000 marched the Bowery. Now, Sullivan was known as the king of the Bowery, and there actually was a queen of the Bowery too, much later, Maisie Phillips Gordon, who right at the base of the Bowery where there was this old movie palace, this was her ticket cage that she hung out in, and she would give candy to kids that would come up. And when she got off work, she was famously always handed out, a little bit of help to some of the drunkards and the down and out and the homeless on the Bowery. It was a great novel about her. Photographer Berenice Abbott had come back from being an expatriate in Paris and wanted to get a job with under the auspices of Works Progress Administration. And they said, well, what would you like to photograph? And she said, I'd like to photograph the Bowery. And the official said, oh, nice girls don't go to the Bowery. And she said, I'm not a nice girl, I'm a photographer. And they, of course, let her do her thing. And she produced a wonderful book, one of the best photographic records of New York, Changing New York. And one of the oldest cemeteries in New York City, New York Marble Cemetery, is behind Bowery, between the streets of 2nd and 3rd Street. The oldest community garden, Liz Christie Garden, on the corner of Houston and Bowery. This building, 190 Bowery, this area, the Bowery, beginning in the 1950s and 60s, because the street itself was very run down. It was very on hard times, so that the rents were very cheap. And just like more famously with Soho, the Bowery became a magnet for artists looking for inexpensive places, especially lofts and larger spaces. And 190 Bowery, in addition to Roy Lichtenstein living there and other artists, Jay Maisel lived there. And just a few years ago, he sold the place he had bought for $102,000 for $55 million. And that remains the largest single private real estate deal in the history of New York City. Another space that housed artists was 22 Bowery. This was the Young Men's Institute in its heyday, and then later William Burroughs, John Giorno, and Mark Rothko, who painted his famous Seagram murals here, lived in this building. And artists still occupy 222 Bowery. This is a cast iron New York City landmark, the Bowery Lane Theater. And lots of really cool things have happened here. Bernadette Peters made her debut here. And Tennessee Williams' last play that he wrote that was performed in his lifetime was performed there. I actually sat right behind Tennessee Williams in one of the productions, one of the performances. This is a piece about the Five Spot Jazz Club. Unfortunately, the building's not there, but this is where improvisational jazz was born as practiced by Ornette Coleman. It was also this jazz club because it was in the Bowery and it was not an area that got a lot of attention. Billie Holiday was able to perform at the 5 Spot, even though she had lost her cabaret license because of a drug conviction. And the club said, you know, Billie, come here. We won't advertise that you're on the bill and people will come. And they did. And it was some of her last performances. Finally, we come to this one, CBGB, founded by Hilly Crystal and all these great performers, the Ramones, Patti Smith. And, you know, it was very sad that the club closed down. And as Dave said in the beginning, if you would like to get the book, it is available in the Tenement Museum gift shop, or you can contact them online or by phone. You can also go to our website. And if anybody knows of any windows on the Bowery or elsewhere that you might be able to help us get a poster displayed, we would much appreciate it.
David, that was really a wonderful journey through the book and so many vibrant, colorful, just really rich and complex stories. Thank you for taking us through that journey. We're at 8 o'clock, but I wanted to, you know, make sure we had a time. That's okay. I think we all lost track of time with all of those really amazing images and stories. But just, you know, one of the questions I had, and that's come up in the chat, you know, we don't have time, unfortunately, to get to all of them. But one thing I've been thinking about as I was listening to the stories is one of our audience members or several have posed is really, you know, what the this is such rich and interesting history. But you know, seems to me that part of the story here is that, you know, this was explored and undertaken as a project really in the interest of preservation, of efforts to make the Bowery, you know, the kind of space, or keep the Bowery the kind of space it's been for its history in the face of what you had called overdevelopment. So some of the folks in the chat have been asking about, you know, the applicability of this kind of model using history in the effort either to preserve or to prevent overdevelopment, however you might think about that. And I was wondering if you might say a few words about that, how you think about the intersection of those kinds of things.
Well, again, there was this, you know, negative stereotype of the Bowery as just being a rundown street with flop houses and dive bars. And so when we would say, oh, you know, this is a very important street and you need to preserve it, we felt that we really needed to get that message out there. That's why we got the street on the State and National Register of Historic Places. We were able to get some individual landmarks, but we had also tried to get a Bowery Historic District, and that did not fly. And several people suggested doing some kind of signage effort. And then, of course, Mindy is actually the first person that said, this should be a book. And that was before the posters were even completed.
The power of graphic
very
design.
What?
The power of graphic design.
Yes, thank you.
Great. And yeah, and I think the power of place here is, you know, I think at really visible here. So, you know, really wonderful work, and I hope you'll be able to achieve some of those goals, perhaps a city district on the Bowery in the future. One other question from some of the viewers was a quick one, was whether or not the posters are available to view online, or is it only in the book? Is there like a digital version of this? Or are you perhaps planning one?
There is. If you go to our website, which our website not only can help you get the poster, there's a lot of extra information about all of this, but we actually have the entire poster series available to look at online. You can scroll through all of them.
Terrific. Well, that's wonderful, and I think thank you again, David and Mindy, for taking us through this incredible history and sharing, the story of this really wonderful project that has had so many interesting iterations. Seems to have had such an impact for our viewers. I want to thank you as well for tuning in and spending the evening with us. Again, as David mentioned, the book Windows on the Bowery, 400 Years on New York City's Oldest Street, is available for sale at the Tenement Museum shop, in person and online, and of course at the Bowery Alliance of Neighbors, boweryalliance.org. So please stay tuned for future Tenement Museum virtual events by signing up for our newsletter at tenement.org. We'll hope you'll join us again for future talks. Thanks again. Take care. There's the book. David is holding it up. So thanks for showing the size of it. But thank you both, and thank the viewers for tuning in. I want to wish everybody a good night. Good night.
Thank you, Tenement Museum. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.